Right, hey everyone. There we go. Where's that guy who yells? I need him right now. Cool, yeah. Hey everyone, I'm Ed. I'll try and keep this super fast because I realize it's getting late. It's Tuesday evening. It's a work night, all that kind of thing. I'm going to talk to you about like some tips and tricks about working with LLMs. Basically, all the stuff. So I left my job about 8 months ago to create a startup, an AI startup, because the world needs more of those. And I basically spent a whole ton of time wrestling with LLMs, building an app that integrates them in pretty much every possible space. And this is all the stuff that I kind of wish I knew beforehand that I've figured out from scratch whilst going. So yeah, before I start, like a little bit about my company, Ignitus. So we're trying to solve like two problems. And I think probably the easiest way for all of you to get this is to do it visually. So hands up in this room if you have a mentor. Wait, is that it? Oh, okay. So there's problem number one, right? There's like 5 people out of, I don't know what this is, like 50, 60 people. And all the stats show that like if you have a good mentor, or even if you have any mentor, right, like you're 60% more likely to get promoted, right? So these 5 people are all going to get promoted over you because they got a mentor, right? So that's one problem. The second is, so who had your hand up? One of you? Okay, I'm going to pick on you down here. I can't see your name badge, but Byron. What's your mentor called? Peter. How many people in this room get advice from Peter? Just Byron. Okay, that's problem 2, right? Peter might be an amazing mentor that has tons of advice for like data scientists, machine learning engineers, product managers, whatever it is you guys are working on. Why does only Byron get that advice? Right, so think about those 2 problems. That's what we're doing at Ignitus. We're building, and here you go, like an AI-powered mentor to take like expert advice from different people, different coaches, everyone like expert in their little domain and expertise, and then combining it all to build this like super-powered AI mentor that can help you with everything in your career. So ton of stuff to do, obviously, because we're trying to solve all sorts of problems, but a really exciting one, and one I think we can use LLMs to do a lot of. My point of being here is not to pitch my company, it's to talk to you about how you can kind of work with LLMs. So I'm going to take a few little things. We'll talk about some prompts. We'll talk about agents later, evaluations, stuff like that. And I'll just try and run through a few little things that might work well for you. My first thing with prompts is like, always treat the LLM like it's an enthusiastic intern that you've been handed, right? And that's like their first day and they're like, yeah, I want to please, what can I do? Right? And if you think of an LLM like that, you'll generally do a good job of like writing a prompt for it. You have to think like it's always going to want to do the job, but it may not do the best job, right? So the first thing to do is to write a well-defined task. So you can say like, write a blog post here, pick a company name or something. Roosh was a company I actually visited recently, so I've had their name on here. Actually, I did update it for today. I thought I'd updated it. I just forgot to update it here. You can see here. Write a short and impactful blog post about Selden. That's what it was supposed to say. But this is the original one, right? Like write a blog post about Selden. Not very helpful. Like it might do a good job, but it's probably going to be really vague. Way better would be to say like the target audience are technical professionals, interested in AI and emerging tech trends. Make sure to cover the company history, competitors, highlight strengths and weaknesses, etc. Like the more context you give it, the more information you give it, the better it does, right? It's obvious. We've probably all learned that already, but if you haven't, it's a good one to start with. So the other one is avoid negatives, or maybe I shouldn't say that. I should say like be positive or something, because that is a negative there. But tell the LLM like what to do, or not what not to do, if you see what I mean. If you're anything like me, my wife sends me to the shops and goes like, oh yeah, don't get the skimmed milk, right? You bought skimmed milk last time and nobody drinks it. So what do? I get to the shop and I think, she said something about skimmed milk. Yeah, I better get skimmed milk. And I go home and I get an earful, right? That's basically what an LLM does as well. It's like you tell it don't do something, and all it does is really see all those tokens that you just gave it, and it thinks, oh, I should do stuff around that. So don't tell it what not to do. Try to tell it what it should be doing instead. You can use an LLM to help refine your prompt, and there's like lots of advice on this online. People say like spit it in and say, here's a prompt, make it better. What I like to do is is to say, instead of, it's a prompt, say like, here's a task brief. Because generally the internet doesn't have tons of prompt engineering advice on it, or maybe it does now, but it probably didn't when most of the LLMs were trained. So what's better is to say, here's a task brief. If I asked you to carry out this task, tell me what additional information would make it easier for you to do a good job. Highlight any areas where the instructions are vague or unclear. And generally what will happen is the LLM will give you really good feedback on, hey, actually, if you could tell me a bit more about this, I could do a better job. And then you can kind of rewrite your prompt and just iterate like this. Another one is to involve users. So as I mentioned, we're doing this kind of mentoring coaching product. I was a bit reluctant to kind of hand over control of prompt writing to my non-technical co-founder, but he does have a great background in coaching. So what I was trying to do was kind of get his knowledge and then write the prompts myself. And he kept saying, oh, I want to write the prompt. And I was like, I don't know if I want you to write the prompt. He was like, I want to write the prompt. I was like, it's not a good idea. It turns out it was a good idea, and I should have listened to him earlier. Like getting him involved, teaching him, just some of the basics around how to write a prompt, but then giving him a little endpoint that he could go and play with, change it, interact with the app again, change it, interact with the app, saved me tons of time. And actually, he's the one with the coaching experience who understands the problem that he's trying to solve for the user. And if all of that fails, right, you can just gaslight the LLM. So you can say write a short and impactful blog post about Selden, or better, write a short and impactful blog post about Selden. I will get fired if you do a poor job. And there is actually a paper that you can go and read on this where they did show that if you emotionally, if you emotionally prompt your LLM, it performs on average 8% better, right, in their evaluation. I don't know. Again, this is so going back to the thing where I told you about my co-founder and him giving him access to the prompt. I also told him this, which was such a bad idea, because I went in and looked at the prompts he'd written, and it was just filled with stuff like, oh, if you don't do this, my family will be kidnapped. And it was like, write it in this format, if not, I will drop down dead right now. And it was just so dramatic. But it seemed to get him to where he wanted to be. So I don't know. Cool. So let's talk quickly about RAG. Hands up if you're familiar with RAG. Okay, great. So nearly everyone here. We won't need to go through the recap then, basically, but we have a question, we retrieve information, we add that information into a prompt, and then we fire it to the LLM, and then the LLM gives us answer based on the context, right, that previously the LLM didn't know. Now it's a great, if you use tools like LangChain, Llama Index, you can set all this up in no time, and it's a really great place to start. But when you start building RAG and evaluating it a bit and trying to understand what's happening, you realize this step is actually pretty naive, and you end up adding extra things in. So let's look basically at retrieving the relevant information. The first thing you'll find is that doing semantic search on stuff is probably often not enough. When I looked at the docs I was getting back, I was like, okay, they're good, but I'm missing key bits of information. Maybe it mentions an acronym, but the acronym is somewhere else. And because it was part of a wider document that had been chunked, and therefore the semantic meaning of it was slightly different. So what you tend to find you get better results doing is retrieve the relevant, I don't know, top 20 documents as an example, feed them through a re-ranker. And what a re-ranker does is it looks at okay, what's the query? What are all the documents we've retrieved that are semantically similar? But then of those, let's do another search across them and see which of them actually reference things in the keyword. So if you can think of it the re-ranker could, for example, be keyword search, which would be incredibly slow over a huge corpus of documents. Whereas vector search is incredibly fast, which is why we like it for pulling back, the top 20 documents. But then, and actually the one I'm using is a hybrid search that does breaks your document into small chunks, and then it also does keyword search, and it combines the results of all of them. It does clever stuff I don't even pretend to understand, but it gives better results basically. And then you can use these retrieved information to then put in the prompt. The other thing is that the input query on its own, you can't just fire that into your vector database and go give me the best, take the vector. Sorry, rambling here. Some vector databases will let you just give them a query and they'll do the embedding for you. In general, you probably embed it, then you'd fire the embedding in and say, look for similar things. But that doesn't work, because what happens if let's say the bot responds with, okay, there are 3 things we could do here. We could look at your mindset here. We could talk about some of the problems you're having at work. Or we could just dive straight into an exercise on like breathing or something. I don't know, some sort of coaching thing that you could be going through. And they go, yeah, let's do the last of those. Well, if I feed in just the words, yeah, let's do the last of those, embed it, and then search for relevant documents, I just get like garbage, like generic stuff, because it wasn't actually relevant. What they meant was they wanted to do the breathing exercises. So what you end up doing is you end up having like a little step at the front where you take the question, and then given the context of the chat, and you can choose, like, I think in mine, I've got like, I take like the last 5 messages, because I don't want to feed in the whole context. It ends up being a slow step. I want it to be quick, but also retain enough so that I can kind of understand what was the actual standalone query that the user was asking. And then I use that to retrieve stuff and feed it through the rest of the thing. The other thing is that the way you chunk documents matters a lot. So if you have long maybe it doesn't matter so much now. Lots of models have huge context, so you can just like not chunk things. But when I started building, like having 4K, maybe 16K was like decent. I kind of wanted to build everything so I could fit within a 4K context window, also because of costs. So I ended up chunking documents down, but then how you do that really matters. There are lots of different retrieval techniques you can then do as well. I use something called a like auto merging retriever, which basically looks at, so let's say you've got a long document. So in my case, I'm working with a lot of YouTube videos. I think someone earlier mentioned something about YouTube. With the transcriptions I have for them can be pretty long if it's like a 30-minute video. What I do is I chunk that up and store all of those in the vector store. But like where I chunk it is quite difficult. Like, should I do it every 512 tokens, for example? Or should I do it every 1,000 tokens? Should I just do it every paragraph and then I have different size chunks? Then it's much harder to fit them all into the right size context window. So there's like different ways you can do it. The one I use that I found, and kind of anecdotally and with a bit of evaluation, that had the best results was an auto merging retriever, where you basically take the whole document, you chunk it up, and you chunk it up again, and then you retrieve the small chunks, and then you look at it and say like, oh, did I get a bunch of chunks from this big document? Oh yeah, if I did, retrieve the whole document, because probably all relevant, even if like, so hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, okay, people are nodding, so yeah, I don't need to explain it again. Sometimes I wonder if I explain these things well or not. Cool. So talking about like controlling the LLM, and this is more about like the outputs you get from the LLM and the responses. One thing to do is to use multiple steps. So instead of, and this is actually a problem we had, so I'm just going to put this all up so I can kind of point at things. For example, okay, this is not the actual prompt, but like we had similar things like this, respond to the user's message in the following way, and you might have like a series of instructions that you have in your prompt. And then something that we have, because we're doing like a mentoring and coaching thing, is like pose a thought-provoking question that will keep the user engaged, right? It's not as generic as that. It would be like more specific to their problem. But we basically don't want it to do a ChatGPT thing where it just gives an answer and that's the end, right? We want it to be like a constant back and forth that someone's having. Now, what happens if you put it at the end of a whole load of instructions, actually sometimes it just like forgets to do it, which is a bit rubbish. But actually breaking it into two steps where you basically say, okay, go and follow these instructions, respond to the user, and then you feed it back into the LLM and say, okay, now given the user's message and the response that you've already said, okay, give me a thought-provoking question. And guess what? We got way better thought-provoking questions because it also was aware of like the other stuff it had. Interestingly, like from a mathematical point of view, that probably shouldn't happen, right? Because when a model is generating its tokens, it's already got like the other tokens it's generated as input. But for some reason it does. I don't know. Maybe it's because of all the like pre and post processing that happens behind the scenes in the API that you don't really know about. Another thing, so there's some stuff you can do, like you can add structure to your outputs and then use things like early stopping to control them. An example of this is You will all be familiar with this. If you ever use ChatGPT, you ask it something. So in this case, tell me why bananas are the best fruit on the planet. And it gives you a load of stuff about bananas. And then it says, remember, whilst bananas are an excellent fruit and contain lots of potassium, it's important to eat a variety of different fruit and vegetables for a healthy, balanced diet. And it gives you this like preachy paragraph at the end of everything. You ask it, what would be some good stocks to invest in? It's like, remember, stocks could go up or down. And it's like, and I'm almost certain this is like heavily baked in by the OpenAI's reinforcement learning they've done or some of their safety mechanisms. But I tried so many things in the prompting, trying to get rid of these like preachy paragraphs, and there just wasn't like an easy way to do it. The best thing I found was to be able to say, okay, in my prompt, I was like, structure your answer in this way. So, add like a tag, for example, your answer, main answer, and then wrap everything in a conclusion. And then what I can do is then when I communicate with the API, I can say, oh, if you reach this token, just stop generating. So, and that basically tricked it into not giving me the preachy paragraphs at the end. So there are some little tricks like that you can do as well. Again, you can build like more structure into what you're doing and put tags around everything. Cool. And then this is probably the only like open source library I'm going to plug a little bit. But I found guardrails is super easy just to add like post processing steps. Some of the things we have thinking about like mentoring and coaching people, we don't ever want to stray into the like realms of mental health. If someone starts to show a discussion around mental health, we want to be able to flag that and like either send them to a correct provider or very strongly, message them back and be like, this is outside the realm of what we're dealing with, right? The last thing we want is our mentor that, creates some sort of travesty going on. So that's one that we want to look out for. But then there are simple things like, actually, for some of the businesses we're going to start working with, they really care about like whether personally identifiable information might get leaked out or company secrets, those kind of things. We want to detect those before we send them to a model API if we're using one. And then equally on the outputs, you might want to know like, yeah, is a competitor mentioned, right? If I'd built this if I was building a chatbot for my own docs on my website, the one thing I don't want is for it to go and spit out a load of things about my competitors, right? So someone goes like, oh, give me some alternatives to this, and it does it. So yeah, guardrails is really good for that kind of thing. The only thing to think about is like, if you're building a user-facing app, people kind of expect streaming responses now. And it's really horrible if you don't have streaming responses because people just sit there twiddling their thumbs for like 15 seconds. But it adds complexity because if I want to, let's say use the example previous talk, right? Your Elasticsearch, you built a little search bot over your docs and someone comes in and goes, hey, give me some competitors to Elasticsearch. And because you're a good bot like Miguel, you don't mention any competitors, right? You just say, sorry, I don't know other databases exist. But actually what do you do, right? If you're streaming that response and then suddenly it's like, oh, it's mentioned a competitor, what do? Do you take back the response and just immediately revoke it from the UI? That's a weird experience. So like, there's kind of, you have to think about like how you handle these. What I found was a good way to do it is I basically like send them in chunks. So I look for new line characters, which typically signifies like every time it's written a paragraph or something like a short bullet point. Then I can do some post-processing and then I'll send it to the UI if it's okay. So I can kind of just stop early and it still seems like a reasonable response. Evaluation, right? So I won't pretend to be particularly good at this. I did even look at some of the libraries out there. There are tons of them. If you have used one and got really good results and think it's amazing, do come talk to me afterwards. Or if you have really good evaluation steps, because evaluating the responses is honestly like one of the biggest challenges we have. And I think everyone has in the space. Typically, the way I've approached this is to say, if I can, evaluate them manually. There's no substitute. It's incredibly time consuming and it is a little bit like hand wavy. You're kind of like, yeah, it feels like a good response. But like, if it feels like a good response, it probably is, right? Particularly if you do it several times and it's still giving you good stuff. But what I did do some more like scientific stuff to this. So I built a test set with my co-founder, basically like 10 very good example questions that like people might ask our system. And then I basically asked my co-founder, I was like, could you write the exact response you would give for that? So he's, when we built our MVP, we built it around negotiation, and he's a negotiation coach, so it works really well. And I was like, what would you say if a user said this? Or like if you were giving someone a coaching session and they did that. So now we've got a test set, we've got the example answers. What I can then do every time I make changes to the system is I can generate responses based on the test set. So I can give them all the questions, get all my like test answers back, but then I don't want to go and read those all and compare them. So I throw them in an LLM and I say, can you evaluate these based on it? So I go, here's a question, here's the model answer, here's a generated answer. How well does it compare? Give me a score out of 10, right? And it's, again, I'm delegating a lot of the work to the LLM, but if you do it over enough generations, you get a pretty good response. So what I would then do is do this. In fact, I do have this. So I would run it like 10 times and then average out the scores. Again, you need to do that because LLMs are like non-deterministic. You'll get different responses every time. You want to know that like on average, it does a pretty good job. And what I found here is like, if I've got a test set of 10 things, I generate 10 responses for each of them. Okay, 100 LLM calls. It's not like insignificant, but it's not too bad. The one thing I would point out is that like 10 is a ridiculously small and rubbish test set. It works fine for like a small MVP, but how we're going to scale this, I'm not quite sure. And it's going to become very, very expensive. So yeah, the evaluation is just going to be tough. Like when we're covering all sorts of different domains, like you change one step in that RAG process, you want to go and evaluate what happened. You know, we changed the re-ranker. Do we get better responses? Like you end up with this very long chain of like moving hyperparameters that you kind of go like, oh yeah, okay, let's change one thing at a time and evaluate again. So it's pretty difficult to do. Okay, moving on, agents. Just a quick note on that, because we've built some like reasonably interesting agents that we've now like added into some of the coaching stuff we do. This is my quick definition on this, because everyone has their own one. Just to be clear, like I think of an agent as a system that can take action autonomously whilst working towards a goal. So basically, same thing, you know, same way you give an LLM a prompt and say, go away and give me an answer. You say, give it a task, go away and like get some shit done, basically is what I'm expecting. Here's an example. So we can take that blog post we wanted. So write me that blog post about Selden, ideally with a better prompt than that, because we learned from my first lesson. But instead of just giving it to an LLM, we give it to like an LLM who's role-playing as a researcher. And we say to them, you also have access to search the web. So it can go out and it basically, and we say, what you need to do actually is you don't write the blog post. You need to prepare all the content and information we're going to need to write this blog post. And that researcher then passes on this kind of research report to a writer who's now role-playing. You're now a writer who's an expert at writing very articulate and interesting blogs. Here's a bunch of research that's been done for you. Go and write the blog. You feed that onto an editor who has you have a keen eye for spotting mistakes and critical, things that have been missed. And then you give them the original brief and you ask it to iterate, and maybe we'll delegate it back to the writer, for example, and say, could you make a redraft of this bit? You didn't mention enough competitors or whatever, right? And if you build up these kind of agentic systems with roles in them, you'll get a way better response than if you'd just thrown it at the LLM in the first place. And then you get your answer out at the end of it. So the tips for this are generally think like a manager. If you try to think, every task that we do or that you ask an LLM to do can probably be broken into smaller ones. And then think about it, if you were a manager and you had unlimited resources and people you could just, pay to do all sorts of things, who would you ask to do it? If you were compiling a financial report, right, you'd probably ask a bunch of different analysts to go away and look at different stocks. You wouldn't just say to one person, do all of that. That's how you need to get it into your head about when you're building the agents. And then, I think I mentioned this, but break the jobs into smaller tasks, define the roles well. This does matter. Again, I should probably include a link. I don't think I have it here, but there's a paper that shows the roles are really important. If you say to them, take that financial analyst one, If you just say, you're an analyst, go and research this stock, it won't do as good a job as if you say, like, you're an FCA accredited senior analyst who has an experienced repertoire of, investing in high yielding stocks. Now go and invest. I don't know why, right? Just because of all the crap on the internet that these LLMs have been trained on. But it does seem to do a better job. And then use these kind of agentic design techniques. So these are things that you've probably seen in like prompting stuff before, but the chain of thought, and planning, asking the agent or the LLM to think out what are the steps you would take to solve this problem and then execute them rather than just go ahead and do it. The tool use thing I mentioned, like searching the web or searching databases or executing code, all sorts of things. Reflection is the bit that editor's doing there, where they're looking at the result and saying, well, does this accurately meet the brief that I've been given? If not, what needs changing? And then collaboration is the bit where they communicate with each other, potentially delegate things to each other and so on. Okay, I've been through a hell of a lot of stuff. You probably all think like this now. If not, then I'm sorry, you probably knew it already, but hopefully there was at least one piece of advice that you could take from that. To recap super quickly, so treat your LLM like an intern. That's the main one. But RAG is going to get tricky as you start to build it in production. It's just like so many little steps that you can change and everything else changes. Use techniques to constrain generations if you need to, like try and control that as much as possible. Evaluation is hard, it's subjective. I definitely don't have a good answer there. Let me know if you do. And then think like a manager when building agents. Oh, and finally, of course, check out Ignitus if you're after great career advice. And we're raising our pre-seed round at the moment as well. So if you're an investor or if you know investors, do come find me. So other than that, thank you very much. Any questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah, so for that one, I've actually built my own little agent that's it sort of like monitors the chat, and it's essentially just like a classifier. But obviously, I don't build classifiers anymore. I just throw them at LLMs because when you got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But that will like basically monitors the chat history, and if the topic comes up, it basically just returns a flag to me and says like, okay, my little agent returns true, and then I can just inject like something to happen. So that's the only one I've built myself for that. The others I've just used like off the shelf things from guardrails around like PII to test it and so on. Yeah, so I literally write a prompt for the LLM that says, here's a conversation between a user and a coach, right? If this conversation looks like it is steering towards or has reached the something along these lines, right? Like the topic of mental health, return with the words true or whatever. Or in fact, I ask it to return some JSON, right? So that and then I can, with the OpenAI API, I can tell it like return JSON equals true, right? And then I get something out. And then if I get that JSON response as true, then I can just like stop generating stuff and I can inject a pre-canned message. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, I've only built sequential agents so far. I have seen that like a lot of the libraries. So I've used Crew AI and AutoGen from Microsoft. Mostly used Crew, and then there are a few bits that I've just built myself because actually having the library was kind of abstracting me from too much. They do have support for parallelism. So actually a good example, I'm going to go back again to this one. So here, right, like in theory, if my researcher has decided that the task is to go and research like 5 of Selden's competitors, like I don't really want it to do 5 internet searches, and then I could probably delegate that to 5 different researchers who could each go and research each one of those and compile their own little mini report, and then we could bring it back, and that would be a really good one to do in parallel. You'll see it in like the examples they have around like, yeah, stock analysis is a good one where it goes recommend some stocks and then go in and analyze them all in parallel. Yeah, I'm not hosting any models. I mean, if a client wants to pay us enough, eventually we might, but right now I kind of I don't really care what model I get, right? As long as I have an API that's fast and can reliably generate like coherent text and given the instructions I've given it, and also can reliably generate JSON, that's all I really want. I kind of see it as a commodity, whether I'm using Claude or OpenAI or Llama or whatever, doesn't matter. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much exclusively using OpenAI because I have a bunch of startup credits with them, which definitely helps. Yeah, yeah, but I do flip between like using like GPT-4 or 3.5 Turbo because, or now GPT 4.0, right? For those things, because like if it's a lightweight, small task, like that can like the classification example, right, where I'm going to run that a lot, and it's like needs to be really quick, and actually like classification 3.5 can do it super well anyway. I could do that, and I think maybe further down the line, if I was really optimizing these things, there are some things that I might run with really small models. Um, there are some, yeah, there's some interesting like third party providers now who are doing like abstraction layers over the top. There's actually a London-based company called like Unify ML. I don't know if you guys, yeah, they now do like an abstraction layer where you can kind of give it, you basically give the task and it will route it. It's like a model router. It will route it to either like a super fast, lightweight model or like a really heavy API, right? It's totally up to you, like depending on what the task is. So yeah, there's lots of things you can do. Yeah. Mhm. Mm. Um, yeah, my view on this is that like you should be able to build a perfectly good business without having to have a really like strong technical moat. Um, the the focus just becomes on like all the things that traditionally were important when building a startup. It's like, you know, meeting the customer where they want to work, like providing a good user experience, giving them something that's slightly unique, right? If you can do all of those 3 things, you can build a really successful company. You don't necessarily have to have like your own, you know, model as an IP. Like the fact that, you know, if you build a whole load of sophisticated prompts that achieve something and you have your own little agents running, like you've got tons of IP there anyway. You know, people don't say that about software engineers. Oh, you're all using Python code, you're all the same, right? Like that's my view on it anyway. And I think you can, you know, if you articulate it in a slightly nicer way than I just did, I think that works quite well for investors. Well, we'll find out. Yeah, so we're using Microsoft Azure for most of our, well, nearly all of the hosting because we're on their Founders Hub program and you get tons of free credits. And it gave us OpenAI credits as well. So that was just like an obvious one to join. But I'm not, again, I see cloud compute as a bit of a commodity as well. I don't really mind. Uh, I don't. That's a good question. I defaulted to OpenAI because at the time when I started building, you know, like 8 months ago, they were miles ahead with like GPT-4. Now, I would be less fussed if I built a business right now. Yeah. So we'll do one more question, and then if you have another one, like, because some people might want to go, we'll do last question here, and then you can find me afterwards if you have others. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Great question. This is what we spent a lot of our last few months focusing on. We originally built a B2C app. Like our MVP was a salary negotiation thing, which is very cool for individuals, but like no company wants to buy that. What we found was that whilst there's like propensity for people to pay for like career mentoring individually, the cost to acquire them and like building a B2C business is so expensive on the marketing front. And we, in the meantime, we've spoken to like ton of HR professionals, people who work in learning and development. There's a real appetite for it. Like traditional e-learning that your company provides you is pretty rubbish. They get like 5% completion rates at best. If we can provide like on the job, learn on the fly, but instead of using ChatGPT, which is like, trained on Reddit posts, you've got like advice that's offered based on an actual expert, and it comes with like short form video content and things like that. And these are all the things we're doing. That offers like a compelling experience over just using ChatGPT or a Google search. So yeah, to actually answer your question, the target market is B2B. Our end users are people like you guys. It's like employees of companies, but our buyer is like your head of people or your learning and development manager or whoever it might be. So put them in touch with me if there's a cool thing that you guys want to try out. We're looking for people to pilot it. So yeah, that's another call to action. Cool. Right. If you have other questions, come find me. I'll let everyone else go. Thank you so much for coming.